Hi everyone and welcome. I'm down here with my European nightcrawler systems, preparing to feed. It's pretty routine. I've got a little tray of kitchen scraps, mostly, what is it? There's sweet potato chunks in here, there's some Brussels sprouts chunks, there's some peels from cantaloupe, all kinds of goodies for them. And I've replenished my grit supply. So I pulverized a whole bunch of eggshells I had laying around, so I'm ready to apply grit again, which we did not do last time I was in these bins. And then a couple other staple items, such as a little bit of supplement to the bedding, some used coffee filters, basically paper, and some used coffee. So I'm going to put that glove on and get to work. So we'll start down here in the VermiBag Mini. It was a week ago that we checked in here last, and at that time this system was at the ripe old age of 600 days old. So today, it's now a week later, 607-day-old system. Just looking at the real distinct bulge on that clitellum of that one worm. Just seems like, the type of bulge that you might observe if there was going to be a cocoon deposited soon. And I thought I just saw a couple worms linked together. It always looks like they're kind of not like together in a knot. It's two worms coupled together, mating. I'm sure they're not going to be happy about my intrusion, but that's a good sign. I like to see that. The moisture levels seem pretty nice out here within the system. Most recently I started applying those plastic sheets a little differently. At one point I was using a somewhat small plastic sheet that didn't cover the entire top surface. And then I added a second sheet which didn't help much at all, but then I started staggering them so that one would cover this corner and roll up two sides. Same thing on this corner. And now I feel like I've got much better coverage with moisture remaining even in the corners. Now I believe two of the corners may have been exposed to the air where it might remain a little bit drier. But for the most part, this top surface is now covered really thoroughly with those couple of plastic bags. Alright. I was just growing a little bit concerned about the moisture levels in here, possibly not being adequate. I think we're under control now. Every time I add food, it brings moisture with it. So there's always that ongoing supplement of moisture occurring. So once in a while I'll tell myself that maybe I should add some moisture to the bin, but then I always sort of pull away and I decide against it. And then I just opt for, leaving the system be with the moisture that was added via the most recent feeding. Alright, so as I pick down into the feeding area, which is in my case here down the middle, I'm starting to see some remnants of previous feedings. You can see little scraps of green vegetation. Can't even tell you for sure what it was, but these look like leftovers from a previous feeding. I had picked out some items here that looked to me like food items, and I think what I'm even seeing down here within the bin, these little tiny white specks. A lot of times I'll observe these little white specks in my bins, and I'll incorrectly identify them as grit. But if you look really closely, they are on the move, and they're little white mites, and I can see a couple of items here that have them on them. I've recently observed a pretty good number of them in some of my other systems, and I'm just worried about there being a little bit of an outbreak. But I got to admit, I don't see that many of them in here. And to have a few mites in your worm bin is fairly normal. Nothing to get alarmed about if you should observe it in your own worm bins. But if you start seeing a whole bunch of them, they're still not really a problem. They, you know, basically help with the breakdown of materials. But a lot of times, the best way to interpret their presence in your bin is as a little bit of an imbalance. Usually attested to either excess moisture, which I don't think is really the case here. Sometimes I believe it could be attestable to an imbalance in pH. So some people say to use lime or some sort of chemical approach to balancing out the pH in the bin. But I don't think we're at that stage. I'm definitely contemplating taking steps like that in some of my other bins where I've been seeing lots and lots of mites. But right now my only approach has been to try to keep the moisture levels a little bit lower in the hopes that their numbers start to drop a little bit. So I've excavated a pretty good sized hole in here to add today's feeding. I was trying to size up how much leftover bedding there was from previous feedings. There's quite a bit in here. It's a whole bunch of shredded paper that I had placed in underneath the food, and I've been piling it up over here in this corner. Over here I piled up what I believe was mainly food scraps. So I'm gonna lay in today's feeding in such a way that maybe we'll try piling the old stuff on top for a change. A lot of times I'll just return the old stuff to the bottom, but maybe this time we'll use the old stuff to cover up with. So I've got a couple coffee filters here. So I'm just going to grab a nice generous handful of food. We'll plop it in right there. And then I think we've probably got enough over here to fill up yet another coffee filter. Yeah. So that amounts to what I typically provide my bins as a standard dosage or a standard portion, a couple handfuls worth of food. So why don't we include a bit of grit. I'm going to cover up some of the old food and bedding with grit too. It's been a couple feedings since I last added grit, so I figured I would just go a little bit more generous on this go around with the grit. So let's start returning maybe some of this old food on top of the new food. Get it right back down where all the action's going to be. And, you know, before we put on the old bedding that we retrieved out of the hole, let's throw in a little bit of coffee too. That's about half. We'll save some for the other bin. All right, that was a pretty nice, generous feeding. So let's see, we're going to just drop back in this bedding material that had been previously placed in under the food. Now we'll just kind of put it in on top of the food, because this way we'll be able to locate it a little bit more easily next time. And then we can start backfilling the whole situation over here. Okay, more bedding, more paper, stuff like that. Yeah, you know, I think I'm going to do it this way, where the paper that I had piled on top isn't even really that covered up now. It's just sort of sitting there exposed. Not fully exposed because I will be covering up with plastic, but maybe just creating a little bit more of a cozy spot for the worms to hang out in. You know, a little bit of leftover food there, a little bit of bedding, a little bit of carbon-rich material for them to enjoy right out here on the surface. And then we combine that with the moisture that's going to be recirculating beneath the plastic coverings. And I got a feeling they're going to really like this spot right here on the top. All right. Just bringing back the plastic coverings, pretty much the way we found them. But like I said earlier, what I've been doing lately is trying to nudge one of them into one corner like so. Making sure that those two edges that correspond to that corner are pretty much up against the plastic. And then similarly for the opposite corner, to try to give the bin as much coverage as possible to help it hang on to whatever moisture is down within the bedding. And this has been working really nicely lately. So I think I finally came to the proper method for covering up here. Seems to me like the material in the bin is rather dry. Because usually when my gloves are this clean after feeding a bin, it's an indication that the bin might be a little bit dry. But I'm not going to worry about it. I think from the point of view of the worms, there's probably sufficient moisture within the bin, so I'm not going to sweat it. All right, let's go feed the other bin. Okay, here too we're going to apply a very similar feeding. I guess the one difference we can see here is the covering with paper, whereas in the other bin I pretty much just placed the plastic right on top of the bedding. I like having this paper on here sometimes because you could see how damp it gets, and the worms really seem to enjoy it. I'm really surprised to find only one worm out here. You can see a cocoon resting right out here in the middle of the paper. Quite a high level of moisture in this bin. Quite surprising. But something that I believe that the worms probably really enjoy. And I believe with the high moisture level, it's probably contributing to some good composting action. I mean, even over here right on the corner, you could see some pretty good worm action. And speaking of worm action, is that what we're seeing right there again? Two worms connected together. Getting busy, basically. It's so strange. Just the way they kind of clasp onto each other or whatever it is that they're doing. So we've been treated to a couple, oh here too. We've been treated to a couple intimate views of worms enjoying each other's company, so to speak. Interesting. All right, we'll put these two guys over here on the side and try not to disturb them any further. I'm just looking to get into the middle section of this bin to drop in today's feeding. It feels to me like there's all kinds of stuff all over the place in this bin. There's a lot of leafy material as well as a lot of sticks that go hand in hand with the leaves. And for an 85-day-old bin, I don't think I'll be adding any more leaves, because then otherwise I'll be, stuck with all kinds of little sticks like this within the material. And as you can see, some of them are pretty good size, and they're going to take a while to break down. So at this point, I wouldn't want to introduce any more large, hard substances like that. I'm going to be more inclined to put kind of soft types of bedding in here, such as paper, should I choose to do so. Kind of like those coffee filters that we put into the last bin that we just fed, or the bag that we just fed. I don't know if this is the same two that we observed earlier, or is there just a big mating party going on here? There's two together. I don't know. Seems like we've got ourselves a pretty rockin' place going on over here with worms mating left and right. A lot of moisture, But usually when I see a good amount of moisture, I'll usually want to peek down low to see if there's kind of like pools or puddles developing, which I don't see, which is a good sign. That would be my, I guess, my indicator to say that there's just a little bit too much going on if the water actually begins collecting as little puddles at the bottom of the bin. But until I see that, I think we're just going to treat this as a good damp bin, but not one that requires any sort of remedying or drying. We did a pretty good little inspection of that side of the bin. Right down here in the middle is where we would have placed the last feeding. So why don't we take a peek at how things look in here. I'm already feeling stuff like old mango seed chunks. Both of these, I believe, I remember those from the last feeding. They were placed right on top of the feeding. Oh yeah, so here's some of the bedding too from the last feeding. So I believe we had placed some fresh bedding underneath the feeding, and then we had piled some of the older bedding that we found along the way right on top of the food. So it's pretty similar to what we just did in the VermiBag Mini, where the food, the fresh food and the fresh bedding went down low. Then the old bedding that we located along the way got piled on top. I guess we could do something similar again here. So I'll just see what I could do about pulling out some of the old bedding that I find in here as we go. I could tell some of it is newspaper because it's got print all over it. And I believe some of the bedding was kind of like a, here's another piece of mango seed. Some of the bedding was more of like a paper bag type brown paper that was shredded up. So I don't want to go too crazy here picking through. I just figured if I can isolate and separate a little bit of that type of material, we'll set it aside and use it when we rebuild this feeding area or when we replenish the food supply in here. It does feel to me like in between some of the scraps of paper here and there, I'm encountering little bits of leftover food. I think I can even smell it a little bit. Usually within your worm bins, you don't sense the smell of anything really, just kind of an earthy smell. But here, I feel like I'm still sensing some of the leftover foods that may have been placed in here previously. That doesn't mean to me that I'm not going to add food. I'm still going to add food. But sometimes when I come up on a bin where there's lots of leftovers and then I feed anyway, sometimes I'll just, sometimes in those cases I'll wait a little bit longer between that feeding and the next feeding. Let's say 10 to 12 days. Okay, so things are looking pretty nice here. We've got quite a large collection of stuff here, stuff that piles up high, well above the rim of the container. And I've made reference on a couple occasions now to maybe using the limit, the capacity limit of this container as our reason to call the bin done and to give it time to forage and break down. It doesn't seem like these worms like it when I come in here to feed them. Probably because I'm not only feeding them, but I'm also disturbing their their peace by probing around and checking them all out. But I just figured I would also take a peek over here as long as I had made some nice space here to push the material aside too, so that I can inspect things on this far edge. Similar from the moisture perspective, pretty damp, but not overly damp, I believe. Here again, a lot of times I use my glove as sort of a test to see if things are really muddy and sticky and gooey, they'll be sticking all over my glove. But that's not what I'm seeing here. I'm definitely seeing a good amount of moisture, but the moisture is all seemingly within all of the materials and all of the bedding and all of the castings. And if it was just excess moisture, then I believe it would be sticking to my glove. But I believe we're probably in a pretty good state here as far as moisture is concerned. So I think this was good, you know, from the point of view of tilling it up, I guess, and airing it out. I don't know, airing it out, creating little air cavities, little air pockets, kind of aerating all the material a little bit to not allow things to become anaerobic, which is, you know, just a fancy word for the absence of airflow. And then other types of bacteria start to get a foothold in the bin when that starts to happen, and that's when things start to get a little bit stinky. So a little bit of leftover odor from previous feedings doesn't bother me. It's just when you get that that putrid, rotting smell when there's no airflow. That's what you want to avoid in your bins. So I'm not sensing that here. I believe things are in pretty good shape here. So let's start applying today's feeding here. I think we'll do the same thing again. We'll just nest today's portion within a filter. There's one. And there's the other. Seems like a pretty generous portion for today. I just don't want it to be poking out the top. So let's apply some grit down into these feeding areas. Maybe I'll do the same as what I did earlier, is even give some of the old bedding and old food scraps that I found along the way a little shot of grit. Okay, how do we arrange this so it's not all poking out through the top? I got a good amount of bedding material here, so I'll just use a little bit of it like this to fill the hole partially. But then I'll just use what remains of this coffee here to cover up all the food. Okay, I think we got the majority of it. You can even see some of this pretty dry. So we'll just spread this coffee out nice and evenly around this feeding area. And then scatter all this reclaimed bedding that we found along the way across the top. So I think as the moisture starts to permeate out of the food items that we just added, and as it tries to evaporate out of the bin, it'll get captured by that plastic sheet that covers the top and lock all that moisture in, so it'll keep this central area where the feeding occurred nice and damp. But the plastic actually seems to keep the entire bin nice and damp, because I don't think that there's any sort of greater amount of moisture down the middle. I think it's pretty evenly damp everywhere you look. So here's a worm cocoon, a pretty fresh looking one too, because usually the lighter the color, the more recently it was deposited into the worm bin. But then, you know, looking down a little bit deeper, I could see another one already, which is significantly darker in color. So you can see them side by side here on my fingertip. Fairly light one that looks like it was just dropped into the bin as far as its age is concerned, right alongside a slightly darker one that probably is a lot closer to hatching than the freshly deposited one. So things are looking good in here. It's always nice to see cocoons and worms mating, kind of lining up that next generation of worms for your bin. So 85 days old, pretty good age for a bin. Starts to make me wonder if, you know, between the age of the bin and the capacity of the container itself, whether maybe it's time to start, I don't know, considering the wind down and staging of things to facilitate migration and harvesting of the bin. So I don't feel like I'm really there yet, like I've got to make the decision right away. It does seem like if I wanted to come back in here at another point in the future and feed again, I probably could. But each time I do, I'm going to keep running out of space, it seems. So, I don't know. Maybe at some point soon we'll determine that the feeding that we apply is the last feeding for the bin, at least for a while, and then we'll just allow the worms time to really work down the remainder of the material in here to break it all down neatly, turn it all into really fine worm castings. Okay. Things look really nice over here. I'm gonna get everything covered up pretty much the way we found it. Just wondering what this is. It's such a strange looking little, it's like a loop. It almost looks like a piece of spaghetti. Ooh, some sort of fluid just squirted out of it. I'm just going to assume that it's some sort of a piece of vegetation or something, maybe part of what was fed. Here's another worm cocoon. Alright. Can't seem to resist poking around and examining things sometimes. It is fun, you got to admit, but I think we're done. Get everything covered up, get everything put away. Luckily there's not a lot of cleanup for me to do here, because the bin was pretty neat to work with. Containers are almost empty. I just need to rinse them out and put things away. But before I go, let me just really quickly say thank you. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, as always, please remember to leave me a thumbs up. That's always really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, also consider subscribing to the channel too. That's really appreciated as well. All right, everyone, have a great day. Thanks so much for watching. Bye-bye.